A fisherman pulled an old bag from the river and froze. Inside was a note that changed his life.
The fog hung low over the Susquehanna River, curling like smoke across the water's glassy surface. It was just past 6 in the morning, the kind of hour where the world felt half asleep, caught between night and day. Jake Harper stood on the muddy bank, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. He adjusted the faded baseball cap on his head, the one with the frayed Pittsburgh Steelers logo, and cast his line into the gray murk. The air smelled of wet leaves and river silt, sharp and familiar. A crow cawed somewhere in the distance, its cry cutting through the stillness, while the faint rumble of a pickup truck rolled over the old iron bridge upstream. He liked it here, alone with the river. No voices, no questions, just the soft plink of his lure hitting the water. He'd been out for maybe 20 minutes when he noticed it, something dark bobbing near the shallows, tangled in a mess of reeds. At first, he thought it was a log or maybe a trash bag some jerk had tossed from the bridge. But as he squinted through the fog, it looked off. Too solid, too deliberate. He set his rod down, grabbed the long pole he kept for snags, and waited in a few steps, the cold seeping through his jeans. With a grunt, he hooked it and dragged it toward shore. The thing scraped against the rocks, heavy and waterlogged. Up close, he saw it was a bag, an old canvas duffel, green turned gray, coated in slimy algae. The zipper was rusted shut, and one strap dangled like a broken limb. Jake hauled it onto the grass, his breath puffing out in little clouds. He wiped his hands on his jacket and crouched, curiosity tugging at him. Probably nothing worth keeping. Maybe some camper's junk from a decade ago. He pulled out his pocketknife, the blade scratched and dull, and pried at the zipper until it gave way with a gritty rasp. Inside, the stench hit him first, mildew and rot, like something left too long in the dark. He tipped the bag, and a soggy pile spilled out, a pair of jeans stiff with age, a cracked leather wallet, a rusted hunting knife with a chipped handle. He poked at the mess with the knife, frowning. Then something caught his eye, a small plastic sleeve, sealed tight, half buried under the clothes. He fished it out, the plastic slick against his fingers, and held it up. Through the foggy sheen, he could make out handwriting, faint but legible. His chest tightened as he tore it open, careful not to rip whatever was inside. A single sheet of paper, yellowed and creased, unfolded in his hands. The ink had bled in spots, but the words sliced through him like a blade. "Jake, forgive me. It's my fault. Find her." At the bottom, a shaky scrawl. "Mom." He froze, the paper trembling in his grip. His mom, Emily Harper, had walked out of his life 20 years ago. He'd been 15, skinny and awkward, watching her silhouette disappear down Maple Street one November night. She never came back. His dad said she'd run off with some guy, but Jake never believed it, not fully. And now this. His heart thudded against his ribs, loud enough to drown out the river. He read it again, tracing the letters with his thumb. Find her. Find who? His mom? Someone else? The words spun in his head, sharp and impossible. He stuffed the note into his pocket and dragged the bag back to his truck, an old Ford with a dented tailgate parked just off the dirt path. The drive home was a blur, past the gas station on Route 34, the faded billboards for car insurance, the church with its peeling steeple. His house on Maple Street was a squat, one-story relic, gray siding chipped from years of Pennsylvania winters. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and wood smoke. He dropped the bag on the kitchen floor, the wet thud echoing in the quiet, and sank into a chair. The table was littered with junk, old mail, a half-empty beer can, a photo frame he hadn't dusted in months. He pulled the note out again, smoothing it flat. The room felt too still, the silence pressing in. He stared at the words until they blurred, his mind drifting back. He could still see himself at 15, sitting by the living room window, the streetlights casting long shadows on the carpet. He'd waited for hours that night, thinking she'd come back with her quick smile and a story about getting lost at the grocery store. But the hours turned into days, then weeks, and his dad just drank more, his answers slurred and bitter. "She's gone, kid. Get over it." Jake had stopped asking after that, burying the ache under years of fishing trips and late shifts at the lumberyard. Now, here she was, or at least her words were, reaching out from some watery grave. He rubbed his eyes, the weight of it settling into his bones. What did she mean, "It's my fault"? And who was he supposed to find? His jaw tightened. Maybe it wasn't even her. Maybe some sick bastard was messing with him, dredging up old ghosts. But the handwriting, those loopy E's, the way the M tilted just so, it was hers. He'd know it anywhere, from birthday cards and grocery lists tacked to the fridge. A sharp knock rattled the door, snapping him out of it. He shoved the note under a stack of bills as Aunt Clara's voice called through the screen. "Jake, you in there? Saw your truck pull up with that filthy thing. What's all that about?" She pushed the door open without waiting, her gray hair tied back, a plate of oatmeal cookies in her hands. She lived 2 houses down and had a habit of showing up uninvited, always with food and a dozen questions. "Caught something weird today," he muttered, nodding at the bag. "Just junk, probably." She set the cookies down and peered at it, wrinkling her nose. "Looks like it's been down there since Nixon was president." "You okay? You're pale as a sheet." "I'm fine," he said, too quick. "Long morning, that's all." She didn't buy it, he could tell from the way her eyes lingered, but she let it drop. "Well, don't go catching pneumonia out there. River's cold this time of year." She shuffled out, leaving the scent of cinnamon behind. Jake waited until her footsteps faded, then pulled the note back out. His fingers brushed the photo frame on the table, the one he never moved. It was him at 10, gap-toothed and grinning, his mom's arm around him. Her hair was dark then, her smile wide against the backdrop of a 4th of July picnic. He flipped it face down, the memory stinging too much. "Find her," he whispered, the words rough in his throat. He stood, grabbed his jacket, and headed for the door. Whatever this was, it started with that bag, and he wasn't letting it sit there unanswered. The sun was barely up, a dull glow behind the clouds, as Jake stepped onto Maple Street. The air carried the bite of late fall, crisp and heavy with the scent of wet asphalt after last night's rain. His boots crunched over scattered leaves, yellow and brown, plastered to the sidewalk. He'd barely slept, the note from the bag burning a hole in his pocket. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mom's handwriting, those jagged words looping through his head. "Jake, forgive me. It's my fault. Find her." He needed answers, and sitting still wasn't getting him any. The river had given him the bag. Maybe the town could give him something more. He started with old man Tanner, who ran the bait shop down on Main Street. Tanner had lived here forever, his memory a patchwork of gossip and half-truths. The shop smelled of fish oil and tobacco, the bell above the door jangling as Jake pushed in. Tanner looked up from behind the counter, his glasses perched low on his nose. "Jake Harper. Ain't seen you in a while. What's got you out this early?" "Need to ask you something," Jake said, leaning against the counter. "You remember my mom, Emily? Left about 20 years back." Tanner scratched his stubbled chin, squinting like he was peering through the years. "Emily Harper. Yeah, rings a bell. Pretty lady, dark hair. Used to come in for worms when you were knee-high. Then she just, poof, gone. Folks said she ran off with some trucker, didn't they?" "That's what Dad claimed," Jake said, his voice tight. "But you ever hear anything else? Anything weird?" Tanner shrugged, turning to stack a shelf of lures. "Not much to tell. She kept to herself those last months. Quiet, jumpy, like she was waiting for something. Then nothing. Why you digging this up now?" Jake hesitated, then shook his head. "Just curious." He left without buying anything, the bell chiming behind him. Tanner's words stuck like burrs. Quiet, jumpy. That didn't sound like the mom he remembered, the one who'd laugh too loud at his dumb jokes or hum Patsy Cline while frying eggs. Next, he tried Mrs. Grayson, the widow who lived across from the old elementary school. She was outside raking leaves, her sweater a loud shade of orange. She squinted at him as he approached, resting her rake against the fence. "Jake, Lord, you look like your daddy when he was young. What brings you by?" "Trying to piece something together," he said, shoving his hands in his pockets. "You knew my mom back in the day. She ever say anything about leaving?" Mrs. Grayson frowned, her mouth puckering like she'd bitten something sour. Emily was a sweet girl, but closed off toward the end. I'd see her on the porch sometimes, staring at nothing. Ask her once if she was okay. She just smiled and said, "Oh, you know how it is." Then she was gone. Broke my heart, you being so young. Jake nodded, the ache in his chest flaring. Thanks anyway. He walked off, her words piling onto Tanner's. Jumpy. Closed off. What the hell had she been hiding? By noon, he'd hit a wall. No one knew much, or if they did, they weren't saying. The town felt smaller than ever, its streets looping back on themselves like a trap. He ended up at the library on Elm Street, a squat brick building with flickering fluorescents. The librarian, a bored college kid, pointed him to the microfiche machine in the basement. He spent an hour flipping through grainy scans of the local paper, the Susquehanna Gazette, until he found it, a small blurb buried on page 3, dated November 7, 2005. Woman missing since night of November 6. Emily Harper, 38, last seen near her home on Maple Street. No leads. Police ask for tips. That was it. No follow-up, no answers. He leaned back in the creaky chair, the hum of the machine filling the silence. November 6th. He could still hear the rain that night, drumming against the roof while his dad's voice boomed through the house. Where are you going? Get back here. The door slamming. Jake had run after her, bare feet slapping the cold pavement, but she was already a shadow swallowed by the dark. He'd stood there, shivering, calling her name until his throat hurt. His dad dragged him inside, reeking of whiskey, and muttered, "She'll be back." She never was. Back home, he brewed a pot of coffee, the gurgle of the machine a steady rhythm against his thoughts. He sat at the kitchen table, the bag still slumped in the corner like a silent witness. Steam curled from the mug as he stared out the window, watching a delivery truck rumble past. What if he'd run faster that night? What if he'd grabbed her arm, begged her to stay? Maybe she wouldn't have left him with nothing but questions and a drunk for a dad. He took a sip, the bitterness grounding him. The note sat folded beside him, a taunt he couldn't ignore. The door creaked open, and Aunt Clara poked her head in, her arms full of junk from her attic. "Found something you might want," she said, dropping a shoebox on the table. "Was cleaning out the back. Your mom used to store stuff at my place sometimes." She pulled out an old postcard, faded but intact, and handed it to him. This was with her things. Jake turned it over. The front showed a cheesy shot of the Liberty Bell, postmarked from Philly, dated 2004. The back was her handwriting, no mistaking it. "I had to leave to save her. Don't hate me." No signature, just those words, stark and final. His pulse quickened. Save her? Who? His dad? Him? His mind snagged on a memory, his mom crying once, holding a tiny blanket, his dad yelling, "She's gone, Emily, let it go." He'd been too young to understand, maybe 5 or 6, and they never talked about it after. "What's that look for?" Clara asked, peering at him. "Nothing," he lied, slipping the postcard into his pocket. "Just old stuff." She huffed. "You're a bad liar, Jake Harper. Always were." She left, muttering about stubborn boys, and he was alone again with the weight of it all. He pulled the bag closer, rummaging through the damp mess until his fingers brushed something new, a torn scrap of paper, edges frayed like it had been ripped in a hurry. It was part of a map, hand-drawn, with a red X marking a spot by the river, just past the old mill. An abandoned house stood there, or used to. Nobody went near it anymore, not since the roof caved in years back. He stood, coffee forgotten, and grabbed his flashlight from the drawer. The map felt alive in his hand, a thread pulling him somewhere he wasn't sure he wanted to go. Outside, the sky was bruising into dusk, the streetlights buzzing to life along Maple Street. Whatever his mom had left behind, it was out there, waiting. And he was done running from it. The wind picked up as Jake stepped off Maple Street, cutting through the chill of the early evening. His flashlight bounced in his hand, its beam slicing through the gathering dark. The torn map scrap was tucked in his pocket, the red X burned into his mind, a marker for the abandoned house past the old mill. He'd passed it 100 times fishing, a crumbling shell half swallowed by vines, but never thought much of it. Now it loomed like a question he couldn't dodge. The Susquehanna murmured to his left, a steady hum under the rustle of leaves skittering across the dirt path. Streetlights flickered on the edge of town, their glow fading as he moved beyond the last row of houses. The mill came into view first, its brick skeleton jutting against the sky. Once it churned out paper for half the county. Now it was just a haunt for kids daring each other to climb the rusted fire escape. Jake veered right, following the riverbank until the house emerged from the shadows. It squatted low and crooked, windows shattered, roof sagging like a broken spine. The air smelled of decay, wet wood and moss, with a faint tang of something sharper, maybe old beer. He clicked on the flashlight, the beam catching glints of broken glass scattered across the porch. A crow took flight from a nearby tree, its wings a sudden clap in the quiet. He stepped inside, boards groaning under his boots. The place was a wreck, peeling wallpaper hung in strips, a busted couch slumped in the corner, and cigarette butts littered the floor like confetti. Someone had been here, and not long ago. He swept the light around, half expecting a raccoon or a strung-out squatter to lunge at him. Nothing moved. His breath puffed out, visible in the cold, as he nudged a pile of trash with his toe. Empty cans, a shredded sleeping bag, signs of life, but no answers. He moved deeper, the floor creaking with every step, until he reached what might have been a kitchen once. A rusted sink hung off the wall, and a single cabinet dangled open, empty. Something caught his eye, a loose floorboard near the back wall, pried up just enough to notice. He knelt, setting the flashlight down, and worked his fingers under the edge. It lifted with a splintery crack, revealing a hollow beneath. Inside was a small notebook, its cover warped from damp, pages yellowed and curling. His pulse kicked up as he opened it. The handwriting hit him like a punch. His mom's, no question. The same loops and slants from the note in the bag. He flipped to a random page, the ink faded but readable, October 29th, 2005. I can't keep quiet anymore. She's alive, but he can't know. If he finds out, it's over. Jake's hands shook as he turned the pages. Another entry, dated a week later, I see her in my dreams, crying. I had to do it, but it's tearing me apart. He sank back on his heels, the words spinning. She's alive. Who? His mom wrote like it was a secret she'd carried to her grave, or wherever she'd ended up. His mind raced back to that fuzzy memory, her sobbing over a tiny blanket, his dad's voice barking through the house. He'd always assumed it was about a miscarriage, a sister he'd never known. But what if that wasn't true? What if she'd lived? He sat there, the notebook open in his lap, the flashlight casting long shadows across the room. The air felt heavier, pressing against his chest. He could still hear his dad's slurred rants after she left. Forget her, Jake. She's gone. And that one night years before, when he'd woken to shouting, his mom pleading, Don't make me choose, and his dad slamming a fist into the wall. He'd been too small to piece it together then, just a kid hiding under the covers. Now it clawed at him, sharp and insistent. Had there been someone else? A sister he'd lost, or never even known. The wind rattled the broken windows, pulling him back. He flipped to the last page, but it was blank, the story cut short. He tucked the notebook into his jacket, his mind a tangle of half-formed questions. As he stood, a noise froze him, footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel outside. He clicked off the flashlight and crouched behind the wall, heart hammering. Through a jagged hole where a window used to be, he saw a shadow shift, someone circling the house. The steps paused, then moved closer, boots scraping against the porch. He held his breath, peering out. The figure was tall, hooded, face hidden in the dark. They stopped just outside, close enough that he could hear their breathing, ragged and quick. A hand reached down, gloved, deliberate, and slid something through the gap under the door. Paper rustled as it hit the floor. The figure lingered a moment, then turned and slipped back into the night, footsteps fading toward the river. Jake waited, counting to 30, until the silence settled again. He crept forward, snagging the paper with trembling fingers. It was a single sheet, folded once, no envelope. He unfolded it in the dim glow of the flashlight. Scrawled in block letters, nothing like his mom's script, "Leave or you'll regret it." No name, no hint, just a threat, cold and blunt. He stared at it, the words sinking in. Someone knew he was here, digging into this. Someone who didn't want him to keep going. But why? What were they hiding? He stuffed the note into his pocket with a map and stood, the house suddenly feeling too small, too alive. The walls seemed to lean in, the shadows twitching with every gust. He grabbed the flashlight and headed for the door, stepping over the trash and broken glass. Outside, the night was thick, the river a black ribbon under a sky with no stars. He swept the light across the yard, nothing but swaying weeds and the glint of a beer can rolling in the wind. Whoever it was, they were gone. For now. His truck was parked a quarter-mile back, near the mill, and the walk felt longer than it should have. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, had him swinging the flashlight like a weapon. The beam caught the water's edge, rippling in the breeze, and for a second he thought he saw something, a shape, fleeting, near the trees. He blinked, and it was gone. Just his mind playing tricks, he told himself. But the note in his pocket said otherwise. Someone was watching, and they weren't happy. He climbed into the cab, the engine sputtering to life with a cough of exhaust. The heater blasted cold air as he pulled onto the road, headlights cutting through the dark. The notebook pressed against his chest, a weight he couldn't shake. "She's alive," she'd written. Alive where? And who didn't want him to find out? The threat echoed in his head, a warning he didn't know how to heed. He gripped the wheel tighter, the river slipping out of sight in the rear view. Whatever came next, it was closer than he'd thought, and he wasn't turning back. Jake barely made it home before the adrenaline crashed, leaving him hollowed out and restless. The truck rattled into the driveway, headlights sweeping across the peeling siding of his house on Maple Street. He killed the engine, the silence rushing in, thick and heavy. The notebook from the abandoned house sat on the passenger seat, its warped cover staring back at him. That threat, "Leave or you'll regret it," crinkled in his pocket, a splinter he couldn't pull out. He grabbed the notebook and stumbled inside, the door creaking shut behind him. The kitchen smelled of cold coffee and damp river mud, tracked in on his boots. He dropped into a chair, the wood groaning under his weight, and flipped the notebook open. The pages were a lifeline, his mom's words spilling out in frantic bursts. He skimmed past the entries he'd read, landing on one near the end, dated November 4th, 2005, 2 days before she vanished. "I gave her to my sister in Pittsburgh," it read, the ink smudged like she'd been crying. "He'd kill us both if he knew. Forgive me, Jake. I had to keep her safe." He stopped, the words sinking in like stones. Pittsburgh. His mom's sister, Aunt Ruth, lived there, or had, back when he was a kid. They'd visited once, a blurry memory of a row house with a sagging porch and the drone of Steelers commentary on the TV. After his mom left, Ruth stopped calling. He'd figured it was grief or distance. Now it felt like something else. He leaned back, rubbing his face with both hands. Her? A sister? The idea clawed at him, raw and impossible. He'd grown up alone, an only child in a house that echoed with his dad's temper and his mom's quiet. That blanket she'd cried over, he'd always thought it was a stillbirth, a loss they didn't talk about. But this was a lie he'd lived without knowing. His chest tightened, a mix of anger and something softer. Hope, maybe, or just confusion. He needed more, something solid to hold on to. He grabbed the bag from the corner, rummaging through the soggy junk again, but it gave him nothing new. Just the map scrap, the knife, the empty wallet. The phone rang, shrill and sudden, cutting through the quiet. He jolted, staring at it on the wall, a rotary thing, yellowed from years of neglect. It rang again, insistent. He stood, hesitating, then picked it up. Static crackled on the line before a woman's voice broke through, low and clipped. "You shouldn't have dug this up, Jake." His grip tightened on the receiver. "Who is this? What do you know about my mom?" A pause, then. "You want answers? Come to the river. By the old dock. Alone. Now." The line went dead, a hollow click in his ear. He stood there, The phone buzzing faintly, his mind racing. The voice wasn't familiar, but it carried weight, anger, maybe fear. The dock was a half-mile downstream, a rotting stretch of planks where kids used to fish before it got too rickety. He didn't know who she was or what she wanted, but that threat from the house loomed large. This wasn't a game anymore. He grabbed his jacket and flashlight, the notebook shoved into his pocket. Outside, the night was coal-black, no moon to soften it. The air smelled of frost and river water, sharp against his lungs as he jogged toward the Susquehanna. Streetlights faded behind him, the town shrinking into a hum of distant traffic. The dock came into view, its silhouette jagged against the water's glint. He slowed, sweeping the flashlight across the bank. A figure stood at the far end, tall, hooded, hands in pockets. The beam caught her face for a second, sharp features, dark eyes, before she turned away, stepping into the shadows. "You Jake Harper?" she called, her voice the same as on the phone, rough around the edges. "Yeah," he said, stopping a few yards off. "Who are you?" She stepped closer, the hood slipping back. She was maybe 30, hair dark and cropped short, her jaw set hard. "Name's Sarah. That's all you need for now." She crossed her arms, staring him down. "You've been poking around where you shouldn't." He bristled, the flashlight steady on her. "Found a note from my mom. Said to find someone. You know anything about that?" Her eyes narrowed, something flickering there. Pain, maybe, or recognition. She took a breath, then spoke fast, like she'd rehearsed it. "Your mom, Emily, she didn't run off. She gave me up to save me from your dad. He was a bastard, Jake. Beat her bloody, threatened to kill me when I was born. She handed me to Ruth in Pittsburgh and disappeared. I grew up thinking she ditched me. Turns out she was running from him." Jake's knees went weak, the world tilting under him. "You're my sister?" The word felt foreign, heavy on his tongue. "Yeah," she said, her voice cracking. "And I hated her for it. Then you, for getting to stay. Found out the truth a few years back, tracked her trail here. Too late, she was already gone." He stared at her, the flashlight trembling in his hand. She looked like their mom, the same sharp cheekbones, the same fire in her eyes. Memories crashed in, his dad's fists, his mom's bruises she'd hide with long sleeves, the fights he'd hear through the walls. He'd been too young to see it for what it was. "Why didn't she tell me?" he whispered, more to himself than her. "She thought you'd be safer not knowing," Sarah said, stepping closer. "Dad was a monster. She left to keep him from hunting us both down." They stood there, the river lapping at the dock, the air thick with unspoken years. Jake's throat burned, tears pricking his eyes. "I thought you were dead," he said finally. "All this time." Sarah's face softened, just for a second, before hardening again. "I thought you had it easy. Guess we were both wrong." She glanced over her shoulder, tense. "We can't stay here. Someone's been tailing me since I got to town." Before he could ask who, a rustle came from the trees, too loud to be the wind. A man stepped out, broad and shadowed, a hunting knife glinting in his hand. Jake recognized him vaguely, Ray Cutler, one of his dad's old drinking buddies, a mean drunk who'd hung around the house when Jake was a kid. Ray grinned, teeth yellow in the flashlight's glow. "Knew you'd show up, Harper. Should have listened to the note." Jake dropped the flashlight, fists clenching. "What do you want, Ray?" "Loose ends," Ray snarled, lunging forward. "Your dad told me to keep her quiet. Didn't count on you sniffing around." Sarah moved fast, ducking behind Jake as Ray swung. Jake caught his arm, twisting it back, the knife clattering to the dock. They grappled, boots slipping on the wet planks, until Jake drove a knee into Ray's gut. The man doubled over, gasping, and Jake shoved him hard. Ray stumbled, crashing into the shallows with a splash, cursing as he flailed in the mud. Jake grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back. "Run!" They bolted up the bank, the flashlight abandoned, Ray's shouts fading behind them. They didn't stop until they hit the road, lungs burning, the river a dark smear in the distance. Sarah bent over, hands on her knees, catching her breath. Jake stared at her, the weight of it all crashing down. His sister, alive, and a past he'd never understood. She straightened, meeting his eyes. He's not the only one who knows. We need to figure out where she went, where Mom ended up. Her voice was steady now, a challenge in it. You in? Jake nodded, the notebook pressing against his chest like a promise. The night stretched out ahead, cold and endless, but for the first time, he wasn't facing it alone. The sky was turning gray with the promise of dawn as Jake and Sarah stumbled back to his house on Maple Street. Their boots left muddy streaks on the porch, the night's chaos clinging to them like damp air. Ray Cutler's curses still echoed in Jake's ears, though the river had swallowed him up, floundering in the shallows as they'd run. Inside, the kitchen felt too small, the walls pressing in with the weight of everything. Sarah's voice, her story, the fight. He flipped on the light, the bulb buzzing faintly, and sank into a chair. Sarah paced near the table, her shadow sharp against the linoleum. Neither of them spoke for a minute, the silence thick with what they'd just survived. Jake pulled the notebook from his jacket, its pages crinkled from the night's damp. We need to call the cops, he said, voice hoarse. Ray's not gonna let this go. Sarah stopped pacing, her jaw tight. Yeah, and tell them what? That some drunk attacked us over a 20-year-old secret? They'll lock him up for a night, maybe, then he's back out. We need more than that. We need her. Where she went, what happened after Pittsburgh. He nodded, flipping the notebook open. The last entry stared back at him. I gave her to my sister in Pittsburgh. Forgive me, Jake. No dates after that, no clues. Just a void where his mom's life should have been. He looked up at Sarah, her eyes locked on the photo frame he'd flipped face down days ago. She crossed the room, picking it up, her fingers brushing the glass. It was him at 10, grinning beside their mom at that 4th of July picnic, the Susquehanna sparkling behind them. Sarah's breath hitched, barely audible. You look like her, Jake said, the words slipping out. Same eyes. She set the frame down, turning away. I wouldn't know. Ruth had one picture. Mom holding me as a baby. She burned it when I was 12. Said it was better to forget. Her voice was flat, but the hurt underneath cut deep. He stood, crossing to the counter where the coffee pot sat cold. I'll make some calls. Someone's gotta know where she went after Ruth. Then we deal with Ray. He dialed the non-emergency line, his hand steady despite the ache in his knuckles from the fight. The dispatcher promised a patrol car to check the river, but her tone said they'd find nothing, or not much. Ray was probably long gone, licking his wounds in some dive bar. Jake hung up, the click loud in the quiet. Sarah sat at the table, pulling the bag closer. She rummaged through it, methodical, like she was searching for something he'd missed. I spent years tracking her, she said, not looking up. Found out she left Pittsburgh a month after dropping me off. Ruth said she was scared, kept looking over her shoulder, talking about him finding her. I thought she meant Dad. Maybe it was Ray, too. Jake poured water into the coffee maker, the gurgle filling the space between her words. Dad never said much after she left. Just drank and yelled. I figured he was mad she'd gone. Never thought he'd... He trailed off, the memory of those bruises flashing back, purple marks on her arms she'd laugh off as clumsiness. He'd believed her then. Now it felt like a betrayal, his own blindness staring him down. The coffee brewed as they sat, the room warming with the scent. Sarah pulled out the rusted knife from the bag, turning it over in her hands. Ruth raised me hard. No room for soft stuff. Said Mom was weak for running. I believed her until I started digging, found letters she'd sent Ruth, begging for forgiveness. She didn't want to leave me. She just didn't know how to fight back. Jake took the frame from the table, setting it upright. He stared at his mom's face, the smile that hid so much. I used to wait for her, he said, his voice low. Every night after she left, I'd sit by the window, thinking she'd walk up the street with that dumb straw hat she loved. Dad caught me once, smacked me upside the head, said I was wasting my time. I stopped waiting after that. But I never stopped wondering. Sarah met his eyes, a flicker of something passing between them. Grief, maybe, or the start of understanding. She didn't abandon us, Jake. She sacrificed everything. I just wish I'd known sooner. The doorbell rang, sharp and jarring. Jake crossed to the window, peering through the blinds. A cop car idled in the driveway, lights off, an officer climbing out. He opened the door, the cold rushing in. "You Jake Harper?" the guy asked, notepad in hand. "Got a report about a disturbance by the river." "Yeah," Jake said, stepping aside. "Guy named Ray Cutler came at us with a knife. He's got a history with my family." The cop scribbled it down, asking for details. Where, when, what Ray looked like. Sarah chimed in, her voice steady, filling in the gaps. The officer nodded, promising to look into it, but his tone was tired, like he'd heard a dozen stories like this before. He left with a tip of his hat, the car rumbling off into the gray morning. Jake locked the door, turning back to Sarah. "They won't find him unless he wants them to." "Then we find her," she said, standing. "The river's where it started. Maybe it's where it ends." They grabbed coats and a thermos of coffee, heading out as the first light broke over the rooftops. The Susquehanna was a silver thread in the distance, mist curling off its surface. They walked the bank, starting near the dock where Ray had jumped them, the mud still churned from the fight. Sarah scanned the trees, her steps deliberate, while Jake followed the water's edge, eyes on the ground. He didn't know what he was looking for, another note, a sign, anything, but the pull was there, tugging him forward. Half a mile down, past a bend where the river widened, he spotted it, a small wooden cross tucked against a willow, half hidden by weeds. He knelt, brushing the dirt away. Carved into the wood, faint but clear, Emily Harper, 1967 to 2006. His breath caught, the dates slamming into him. She died a year after leaving, not even 40. Sarah crouched beside him, her hand hovering over the cross like she couldn't bring herself to touch it. "She was here," Sarah whispered. "All this time." Jake traced the letters, the wood rough under his fingers. "Must have come back after Pittsburgh. Hid out, maybe. Didn't want us to know." His voice broke, the years piling up in his throat. She'd been so close, close enough to walk home to find him, and he'd never known. They sat there, the river flowing past, its sound a soft hymn to the morning. Sarah pulled the thermos from her bag, pouring coffee into the lid. She handed it to him, then took a sip straight from the spout. "Maybe we can start over," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not fix it, just start." He nodded, the warmth of the cup seeping into his hands. "Yeah. We've got time now." The sun climbed higher, breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows over the water. They stayed by the cross, drinking in silence, the weight of the past settling into something they could carry together. The river stretched on, endless and alive, and for the first time in years, Jake felt like he could breathe.
Thank you for spending time with our heroes. Share your thoughts in the comments if this story resonated with your heart. Like and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss other touching stories. Share this video with your friends. It might inspire something important.